Okay, so it's just gone 10:04, then we make a start if that's all right. So the first thing I wanted to mention was a little bit in terms of some feedback. So in one case it's feedback from me, and in one case it's feedback from some people in the group as well. So I'll start with the feedback from me first of all in terms of the assignment. So as I went through last week, I'd kind of put up this PowerPoint with some kind of general feedback from what I'd read for your first assignments. At that point last Thursday, I hadn't finished marking everything. I finished marking everything on Tuesday this week, and everything has been marked and has been moderated, and all the marks are agreed. The feedback is all there, it's ready to be released. However, the system sets things up automatically, and your feedback and mark will be available at 2 o'clock tomorrow. Or should be available, famous last words. That's when the system sets it up to go. Okay, so if you are anxious about your mark, don't refresh anything between now and Friday, 2 p.m, because it won't be there. So it should be visible to you after that point tomorrow, because that's the 15 working days after the day you submitted it. Okay, now in terms of the assignment, I don't really have anything extra to add in terms of what I'd mentioned in terms of the general group feedback last week. If anyone is anxious about the assignment, what I would say is, although I can't tell you the marks this morning because they're not out till tomorrow, no assignment failed, and nobody scored a mark that started with a 4, for example. All right, so everyone did well in the assignments. The moderator was really complimentary about what they'd read in terms of the assignments as well. And what I would say, if your mark ends in either a 2 or a 5, then your assignment was really comfortably within the grade boundary that it was in. If it ended on an 8, then it's kind of right up towards the top of that grade boundary. And I don't think in any case, really, it wouldn't have taken an awful lot more to bump it up into the next grade boundary. So if you scored a 68, for example, for the first assignment, and I know sometimes that's quite an annoying mark to land on because it is close to that first, realistically there isn't an awful lot that would have been needed to kind of push it up into that next boundary. So hopefully the feedback there is useful, and potentially some of the feedback in particular around referencing and citations, for example, which I'll just refer to, might be useful as well. Okay, so I just wanted you to be aware of that. Also wanted you to be aware of, regardless what your mark was as well, there was something that was excellent in every one of those assignments. There was really good points that people were making. Okay. Second assignment then is due next Friday, and I know some of you have also got another assignment that you might be concentrating on first. That comes in for Jane's curriculum module on Monday. So I'll just mention this briefly, and you might go, okay, that's fine, Di, but I can't think about it till Tuesday. So in terms of the second assignment, I've put this up on tomorrow's seminar page, for example. So just as a reminder, for the second assignment, you've got one of 4 choices that you're going to pick. The choice, whichever one you do, it's a 2,000-word essay, and this one, rather than being reflective, is going to be a standard academic essay. So in other words, the second assignment is not going to be written in the first person, whilst that was the format that you could do for the first one. Okay, so the first one you were reflecting, so it's entirely right that you were using I think, I've experienced, I am going to talk about. For their second assignment, as it notes in the brief there, this is kind of a standard assignment, so use the third person in terms of that. This essay will discuss, for example. Okay. 4 options you had. One of them then was to do with labelling, and from feedback people have given me so far, this one's been quite a popular one. So quite a few people have talked about labelling. Now I would say we've talked about labelling a lot as we've gone through the module. There is one slide in particular today that I'm going to mention, which you might find quite useful if you are doing the labelling assignment. And then over the last 3 weeks, we've looked at 2 different areas of need. In particular, we looked at dyslexia and specific learning difficulties, and we looked at kind of neurodiversity, neurodivergence and autism last week. So if you're doing the labelling one, entirely fine that you talk in kind of broad terms. So having a label of ALN is beneficial because, but it's a disadvantage because. Equally, if you wanted to, you could kind of drill down into more specific labels. Okay, so I will leave that with you as to however you want to do that one. The second one, the impact of the ALN legislation in Wales. Now this one is quite specific. We focused on this one in week 6, and in week 6, if you kind of doing this one, if you look back, we talked about some of the characteristics inherent to Wales. So we are a relatively small country, we are a relatively poor country, we have a relatively large number of children living in poverty, for example. We'd moved away from sharing a system of SEN with England to having an ALN system of our own. And then I'd linked to some reports from Estyn in particular and Welsh Government towards the end of that session, which talked about how things were going or not over the last couple of years since it's been introduced. Okay, so if you're doing that one, very specifically week 6 is where you'll find that information. The third one, again, this one seems to be quite popular if you're going to look at the kind of autism one. So we focused on autism mainly last week. I'm just going to touch on a few things briefly this morning. But if you are looking at that one, then there are some resources on last week's Canvas. There are some resources on this week's Canvas that you might find useful as a starting point. So here you were looking at things like, what do we mean by autism? What's the definition? How might a learner be diagnosed as autistic, for example? And then you were going to think a little bit about the environment. And a lot of people were talking last week about things like the sensory environment. A lot of people in their first assignments, for example, talked about, what inclusion in mainstream school might be a challenge for some learners because of all the noise and the different lights and the smells in a mainstream school, for example. And then the final one, the inclusion one. Now, realistically, we've probably done inclusion to death over the last few weeks. Inclusion was the main focus, I suppose, of weeks 2 to 6, but it's also kind of in the background of the last few weeks as well. In terms of just some reminders, so I've put the Coursework 2 assignment guidance brief on there. Again, it is on the overview page on the module on Canvas. I've put a link here to the APA brief referencing guide, for example. We did look at this quickly last week in terms of how do you cite the book, how do you cite the website, what does that look like in the in-text, what does it look like in your reference list, for example. I've put a link as well to the library page. So if you wanted further information about referencing, if you click on that library link and scroll down, again, you'll see there's some more information there about the APA guidance. And then I've also put that link there again to the feedback slide we looked at last week in terms of general feedback to the group and a reminder about what needed to go on to the assignment instead of the cover sheet, for example. Okay, so hopefully there's bits and pieces on there that are helpful reminders. In terms of the assignment, we do have our 5th and final seminar tomorrow. Now, in all the other seminars, we've tried to introduce some different content. So last time, for example, we were thinking a little bit about spelling strategies to support dyslexia. Tomorrow, I'm not proposing to introduce any new content, even rather than I'll be in the room on those times if you want to come in and talk about something that you're doing with the assignment. So if you've got any particular questions, if you want me to take a look at something, if you want to check it on the right lines with something, then by all means pop in tomorrow. That's what those sessions will be for. However, logistically, as I said, I am aware that many of you have also got an assignment that's due in on Monday, and therefore you might decide to use your time tomorrow to work on that instead. If that's the case, then I will also be available on Teams on Monday. So for the first piece of coursework, we tried to do a morning, an afternoon and an evening drop-in session where I was there that you could come along to. Now, some people did take that opportunity up. Quite conscious in terms of the time frame between now and next Friday, and realistically next Monday is the only day I can fit anything extra in. So what I've done for Monday is I've set up a Teams link, which is there. I'll also pop it onto next week's Canvas page, and I will be on that Teams link for 3 different hours during the day. So if you've got a question about the assignment, I'll be on that link between 9 and 10, if that works for you. I'll also be on there between 2 and 3, if an afternoon session works better for you, and I will also be on there between 5 and 6. Okay, so if there's anything that you've worked on over the weekend, you just want to check it's okay before you submit on Friday, or you've got a question about something, then you can always pop along to one of those if that's useful as well. Okay, so that's the first bit of feedback I wanted to mention. Marks come back tomorrow at 2 o'clock. They're not going to be there before then. That's when the system is automatically set up to release them. Once you've had the feedback tomorrow, if you do have any questions, if you don't agree with the comment that I've said, if you want to get a little bit more discussion about it, by all means, please get in touch. What I would say is tomorrow, realistically, I am booked up until 7 o'clock tomorrow night, so it may well be that Monday is the first opportunity I get a chance to answer any questions about your mark or feedback if you have any. Okay, so if there's anything you're unsure of about the mark or feedback tomorrow, please feel free to get in touch. But as I said, it might be Monday before I get a chance to answer or talk about things with you. Okay. So that was the first bit of feedback. Second bit of feedback, and this was something that was raised by a number of emails I've had over the last week, realistically. So I did say I would note it this morning. So over the last couple of weeks, there have been concerns that have been raised in terms of people. I'm trying to think of a way of putting this politely rather than bluntly. There has been some concerns raised about the fact that people talking at inappropriate times or loudly sharing things on their screens which have nothing to do with the module have impacted upon the learning experience of some others. Okay, so bearing that in mind, we did say at the start of the module, really, we didn't have any hard or fast rules other than we all learn together and treat each other with the respect that you would like to be treated with yourself. So if, with hindsight, you feel, bless you, that your behaviour potentially hasn't been to the standard you might expect, I'd like to think you've got the self-awareness and maturity to stop going forward. Don't really want to call anyone out on it because that leads to ill feeling. So I'm just going to leave that there because I did say I would mention that as feedback today. And I am aware that that comment is very much focusing on a minority of people, but it's something we need to raise as a class, I suppose. And then the final thing, this is something that Kevin, as Programme Director, asked me to mention today. So I'm just going to mention it now, and then we'll pick it up at the end of the session as well. This is the third bit to do with feedback. Okay, so at the end of the first week, for example, you gave me some feedback about what you thought the module sounded like. Did the assignment seem okay? Did you understand what we were going to look at? During week 5 or 6, I can't remember which one, you gave me some mid-module feedback. So people liked the fact that we did kind of the Padlets, or we had opportunities to share what people felt or what people had experienced. There were issues to do with the lights, which took me until week 7 to work out how to turn them off, but hopefully that's now been sorted. There were some kind of helpful points raised in terms of, you know what, sometimes there's a lot of PowerPoint slides and there's a lot of information on them. And I do agree with that. And the reason I haven't cut those back is because I've tried to put information up on there, not expecting you to process it all during the session, but it might be helpful looking back in terms of informing assignments. And then people mentioned about transcripts and things like that in terms of the videos. So I've made sure that the transcripts and a summary of what we talked about in the session is available as well. The third opportunity to provide some feedback will come up at the end of this session today, and I will leave it open until next week. And realistically, this isn't just for this module. What we're asking you to do for this one is to kind of give some end of semester feedback. Okay, now I've been in your position as well. I know you open your emails, know it's another survey about such and such, and it does get annoying filling them in. So what they've decided to do this year is, rather than having an end of module survey for each module, there will be one form, and I'll put this up and I'll explain it later on, which talks about the 3 modules this semester. Okay, so from the end of the session today up until the end of next week, you will have the option to share some feedback about how the education modules have gone this semester, and any kind of thoughts you have and any kind of suggestions you have in terms of tweaks or changes moving forward. So I just thought I'd note that now whilst we're talking about feedback, but I will stop towards the end of the session this morning and we'll go through it in a little bit more detail. So I think that's probably enough of a preamble before we start. Does anyone have any questions about what we've mentioned so far? Take that as no. So what we'll do then, if that's okay, we'll now move on then to think a little bit about the content for this morning. So, can't quite believe that we're in week 10. Week 5 seemed to be 2 minutes ago, but equally, not sure what happened then. I think we're all at a position where we are all kind of pretty knackered at this point during the year as well. And so is the computer, but it looks like that's having a moment. So what we're going to think about then today is a number of things. So I'm just going to spend a few minutes recapping some of the points that we looked at last week. Now, what I will say is maybe the second point of the board, communication strategies in ASD-friendly environments. This is something that you might be talking about in the essay if you pick the autism one. We kind of ran out of time last week, really, to go through these in much depth, but there is quite a few links up on Canvas in terms of how these work. And in particular, I'm just going to mention again today kind of Makaton as a kind of a sign-in strategy, PECS, the Picture Exchange Communication System, as kind of a visual support, and we're going to very briefly kind of mention social stories as well as a prompt. We're then going to go back and kind of reintroduce the broad areas of need. So that slide that I mentioned that might be helpful if you're doing the labelling one and thinking about the purpose of labelling and how that links to different models of need. Now, I would say a lot of people did pick up on that in their first essay, which is an excellent point that he made. It might be something that's helpful for that essay going forward as well. We're going to think very briefly this morning about hearing impairment and visual impairment. And then towards the end of the session, again, I'm just going to pick up on something that people have mentioned over the last few weeks and also in their essays about what do we mean by access arrangements and reasonable adjustments. So in particular, somebody's doing an external exam in school, for example, you're sitting at GCSE or you're sitting in A-level, what potential support might be put in place for you, and how does a school go about putting that in place for the learner? And it's a little bit more complicated than it seems potentially. And what I'm going to show you a little bit later on is kind of the document, the guidance around it. I'm going to ask you to try and find some information in terms of answering a few questions. And then we'll see potentially, it's, as I said, it's a bit more complicated than it seems. Okay, but we'll take a look at those later on as well. So that's what we're going to try and do this morning. So as a quick recap then, last week we first of all introduced neurodiversity as a label. We talked about the fact that neurodiversity came from the autism community, become increasingly common since kind of the early 2000s in particular, and potentially that label was seen as being quite positive, because it covers everyone. So all of us are part of a neurodiverse population of human beings. However, underneath that neurodiverse term, we also then talked about the fact that people could be seen as either being neurotypical, and suggestions tend to note about 80% of the population is neurotypical. In other words, people tend to learn and process and engage with information in a similar way, and about 20% of the population might be neurodivergent. And neurodivergent we could be using terms like autism, ADHD, for example, but also learners who might be dyslexic, dyscalculic, dyspraxic, for example, also come under that umbrella term today as well. Okay, so if you are thinking about labelling, maybe there's something that comes out there. Is it a positive label because it includes everyone? However, there are challenges. For example, some people see the term neurodiversity and just equal that as being additional learning needs when it isn't the case. We very briefly then thought about some traits and characteristics, and we talked about how an individual might be diagnosed with autism, and we talked about the fact that, this is a medical diagnosis compared to dyslexia, which was an educational diagnosis. But again, it's largely done by observation and checklists and engaging with a range of people, including the individual, families, staff in school, for example. We talked about the fact that some of the criteria had changed, the fact that we used to talk about the triad of impairments, which has now been replaced by the dyad of impairments. So still that impairment and deficit language being used, but in particular, autism refers to those deficits in social communication and social interaction, which we can see on the left-hand side of the Venn diagram. So potentially we might be talking about those individuals who, for example, find eye contact difficult to maintain. We might be talking about those individuals who struggle to recognise and understand facial expressions or body language, for example. We might be talking about learners who are non-verbal or limited verbal. And potentially we might be talking about challenges in relation to kind of building friendships, engaging with other people, understanding the thoughts and feelings of other people. And one of the key things on the bottom of that left-hand side, potentially challenges in relation to imaginative play. And there is a bit more research today which tends to argue against that a little bit in terms of maybe autistic individuals don't lack imagination, maybe the imagination is different. Okay, the other side of the Venn diagram then was thinking about kind of patterns and behaviours. So here again, thinking about the assignments people have done, they talked about people who are stimming, potentially kind of repetitive physical movements. Echolalia, for example, kind of repeating particular words that have been said, those kind of challenges around wanting things to stay the same, difficulties in processing things that change. So going into school on a Wednesday where there's normally swimming, but swimming has been cancelled that day because the pool is closed, finding it a challenge to process those differences. Again, people have talked about that kind of differences in terms of how sensory information is processed, neither being kind of hyper or hypo reactive. So hypo-reactive, potentially not feeling pain. So working with someone at the moment who's writing their dissertation for their PhD about autism, for example, and talking about a family member who fell over on the playground, broke both their legs, didn't show any awareness that they had hurt themselves at all. Okay, so those kind of hypo-reactive responses to sensory information, and also the kind of heightened response. So again, like we said, those children in class who find it difficult to process the sounds, the smells, the busyness that's in a school. A couple of things that were really important. We said keyword was persistent. So it had to be ongoing, normally for a period of about 6 months. And the second important thing, in multiple contexts. So that learner, for example, who's just started showing these traits and it's only in school, for example, might be as a response to something that's very specific to the school environment. If this is something that's been ongoing and they show those characteristics in school, but they also show them at home, and they also show those challenges when you've taken them shopping, and they also show those challenges in the playground, well, potentially that's not a reaction to a specific stimulus or environment. Okay, so we kind of mentioned that last week. We mentioned the DSM-5. This is the kind of the main tool that's used to diagnose autism. And again, the persistent, the multiple context, the deficits. So kind of the conversations, deficit in communication, deficit in maintaining relationships. In terms of communication strategies, we didn't mention these too much last week, but they were on the PowerPoint and there were slides on Canvas in relation to these. So potentially some of these perhaps are a little bit more common than others. So we could be thinking about SIGN or Makaton that I'll mention very briefly in terms as a different way of communicating. Some of you might have worked with children, and I know some of you have, because you talked about it in your essays, where children were engaging non-verbally, but had something like this in the middle, which is kind of an I want board. And this is an example of a picture exchange communication system. So there is a picture starting off with I want, and then that prompt could change, I feel, I need, for example. And then there is a range of different kind of pictures and prompts that they can put onto that board to communicate their need. So in this case, I want help, but we might have one that starts, I feel, and then they got choices of hot, cold, hungry, thirsty, angry, scared, for example. Top of the page, we've got a daily schedule, or what we sometimes call a visual timetable. So realistically, we've got different prompts of different things that are happening during the day in school to give this kind of visual timeline of this is what we're doing now and this is what's coming up. So sometimes we refer to these as now and next boards, for example. So we can see here, this one isn't particularly a great one, but it's an example. This is the morning group. First activity we've got is in group time, then we're doing some language work, then we've got a break, then we're doing some reading, then there's teacher time, whatever that is, then there's going to be a break, then there's specials, whatever that is, then there's playground, and then there's lunch. Okay, so there is that visual timetable showing what to expect during the day. And these are kind of stuck on by Velcro, so what you can do once that bit is now passed, you can remove that from the board as a way to help support that transition of, we've done this task, we're now moving on to the next one. And then the bottom one is an example of a social story. As I said, I apologise, we ran out of time last week in terms of having to go with writing one of these, but the prompt is still up on there if this is something that you'd like to follow up on. So in terms of these communication strategies, many of you may well have heard of Makaton before. Any of you used to watch kind of Mr. Tumble on CBeebies in particular, for example, you will have seen him in terms of using those kind of visual signs in terms of expressing. So the sign language can be really helpful, in particular for learners who are non-verbal. The PECS, the picture exchange one, as I said, this is an I want board. Now I've taken this from an American website. This is just kind of showing examples of toys that might be in perhaps a preschool setting. So that learner who can't tell you that they want to go and play on the sand table is able to kind of take the picture and put it onto their board to let you know what it is that they would like to do. Social stories, I quite like these as an example, and these are quite useful in terms of supporting learners to think about potentially how they might engage in or experience a particular situation. So we'll take a look at some examples shortly, but equally it might be a way as well of showing that other people might feel different. And there were two examples up on last week's slides if you want to look back at these. For example, when I talk to people, people don't listen. I get cross and I hit them. Not me personally, but this was kind of a social story that was set up to try and support the learner to understand why somebody might not have answered them when they talk to them, why it's not a good idea to punch them in the face because they didn't answer you, and to give them a strategy to use instead. So again, I've just taken these two from a particular website. This is from the Speech Therapy Store. Now, the first one is very specific. Okay, so keeping my fingers out of my nose. So this was kind of in response to a learner who maybe spends a lot of time excavating their navel cavities, shall we say, or nasal cavities, who were kind of giving their classmates the ick because they were constantly picking their nose and eating it in class. So this was kind of a story, very specific, concrete prompts with images in terms of saying what to do and why people didn't like them doing it. And then this one a little bit less booger specific, I suppose, but this one looking at when I feel frustrated, I need to ask for a break. I can go and take 5 deep breaths. I can ask to leave the room. I can sit calmly in the corner. When I am ready, I can go back and finish my activity. So quite straightforward, concrete prompts as to what you might do. Okay, so concrete prompts. None of those, if you look at the language, are saying don't do this. So they are quite specific about what you could do or what you should do. And we've got the visual images to support those as well. Okay, so that's kind of the end of a very brief recap in terms of autism. This is the slide that I was mentioning then, which potentially you might find useful if you were doing the labelling activity. Now, we introduced the broad areas of need a few weeks ago. I'm just going to recap it on the next slide as well. But I think this first point, all these highlights on here are mine because I think these points are important. And I've taken this from the Special Educational Needs Code of Practice for England, however, still very similar to ALN in Wales. So I think that first bit is really important, and a lot of people I know have talked about this in their assignment and their draft assignments. The importance of identification is to work out what action the school needs to take, not to fit a pupil into a category. Okay, so if you've talked about that in your assignment, this could be, if you've got words to play with, a nice prompt to back it up. And if we look at what that yellow bit is saying realistically, can we see how that links back to the medical and social models of need potentially as well? Okay, so the whole purpose of the label isn't to go, this learner can't do this, so we need to stick them in that box, which is the medical model. Actually, what we need to do is work out the challenges they experience, which means us as a society, as a school, can better meet their needs, therefore a more social model perspective. So that's one point I just wanted to kind of mention. The second point in the blue, we have mentioned this before as well. Learners can have needs that are in all of the different categories. However, what happens sometimes is a learner has a particular need that perhaps takes more prevalence, and therefore sometimes we forget about the other needs that learner has as well. So that learner might be autistic, but they might also be dyslexic, and they might also have a hearing impairment. So if we only focus on autism as being their main need, do we forget about those other challenges that might need to be supported as well? Bit in the red, I think, might be quite useful as well. If the whole purpose of identifying a need is to work out how to best support it, then it's also worth remembering that every learner has their own strengths as well as needs, and every learner has their own interests. So again, a lot of you have talked before about tailoring things to meet the learner's needs. So that's a nice way of backing that up potentially. And then I don't know whether this bit fits in the assignment, but it's worth mentioning about the importance of, if we are going to support learners using particular interventions, then there needs to be evidence that they work. Okay, and it may or may not surprise you how many different interventions there are that there is no scientific evidence that shows they benefit learners or not. It seems to work, therefore we do them. A few people have talked about in their assignments, for example, a learner being withdrawn from their everyday classroom to go and have some intervention with somebody else. So they've been taken out of the maths lesson that they really enjoyed to go and do some extra English support with somebody. Okay, now there are all sorts of advantages and disadvantages in terms of that. If that literacy intervention isn't making them have more progress than they would have done if they stayed in class, then why are we taking those learners out, for example? All right, so I just thought I'd pop that in there today, partly because I forgot to mention it a few weeks ago, but whilst it's fresh in your mind about doing the assignment, trying to put a positive spin on my forgetfulness, that this might be helpful in terms of that. And then going back to the 4 broad areas of need, we said then these are the ones: communication and interaction. We said autism comes underneath this umbrella term, but so does speech and language and communication needs. So that learner who struggles to process the communication from others, but also finds it difficult to communicate themselves with others. Cognition and learning, differences here in terms of how people process information. And in particular, we talked about memory as being a challenge. And here we had multiple learning differences, found the multiple learning differences, and then the specific ones: dyslexia, dyscalculia, dyspraxia, dysgraphia, for example. Social, emotional, and mental health needs. Realistically, we talked about this about 5 weeks ago, perhaps, when we were thinking about those learners where we were talking about behaviour. So we saw the conversation with Ben, we watched the video clip about Neil and how he interacted with the teacher, and we talked about the fact that many of these learners end up being excluded from school and being taught in different settings. And then we're just going to mention very briefly today the sensory and or physical needs one. So again, might come into the essay, but might not. There is debate around whether it's beneficial that we have broad terms, or should we have something that's more specific? So if you've got a learner in your classroom who is dyslexic, would it be better to have the label dyslexia, because that specifically notes they have challenges with literacy? Or might it be better to have the broad cognition and learning label, which suggests that their needs are wider than reading, writing and spelling? Okay, so I'm just going to mention that there. In terms of behaviour, just going to pick up a couple of things very briefly. We've talked a few times going through the module about behaviour. As I said, we looked at the conversation with Ben, we looked at the video clip from Clockwork Mice with Neil in the school, for example, and just a couple of points really in terms of this one. When we're thinking about behaviour, potentially the terminology we use is really powerful again. Behaviour is, as it says towards the bottom of the board here, I would say perhaps a label that is the biggest risk of exclusion for a learner. As soon as you have that label that's got behaviour attached to it, with the best will in the world, I would say the perception is naughty, and that's not the case. Okay, so when we're thinking about behaviours, are we thinking about behaviours that challenge or challenging behaviour? So I'm just going to pick on Jonathan because Jonathan's in my eyesight. Sorry, Jonathan. So Jonathan's come in today. He's done something inappropriate. Would we be talking about Jonathan having behaviour that challenges, or does Jonathan have challenging behaviour? Sorry, Jonathan. Okay, so there is a difference there in terms of perception. If we talk about Jonathan as having challenging behaviour, then that's within Jonathan. It's his fault that his behaviour is difficult. If Jonathan has behaviour that is challenging, then the issue is the behaviour, not Jonathan. So is there an impact there in terms of how we see that? Lots of behaviour can be linked to things people have mentioned before, like trauma, adverse childhood experiences, for example. Have we seen an increase in behaviours that challenge since the COVID pandemic? I would say definitely yes. I think we've probably all seen these on an anecdotal level. How many people have been on a bus or a train recently, for example, where there's 15 different people in a carriage who are all listening to their music on full blast, that no one's got headphones on, whilst previously they would have had headphones on, for example. Are we seeing increase in behaviours that challenge or challenging behaviour in school as a result of COVID? Is there a link between behaviour and ALN? Yes and no, I suppose, is kind of the answer here. There is no area of ALN where displaying behaviour that is challenging is kind of a trait of it, but potentially as a result of frustration or needs not being met, then that might come through in terms of behaviours. And then this is quite a contentious one. What do we do with those learners whose behaviour is challenging to others? And a common response in some countries is medication, and in particular in terms of ADHD. So we might be talking about things like Ritalin, for example, which I'm sure you've come across previously, or Concerta is another example of a similar kind of medication. And there's all sorts of contentious issues here in terms of, is it appropriate to drug children because their behaviours are challenging to other people? Who benefits from that child being medicated and why? So there's quite an ethical consideration there. So Ritalin is a common response in the UK. It's a common response in North America, for example. However, it's not a common response in other countries. So I can remember a few years ago teaching someone, they were a teaching assistant part-time and they worked in a pharmacy part-time as well. And she used to talk about the fact that a number of parents used to come into the pharmacy and have massive arguments with the pharmacist because he refused to do their Ritalin prescriptions. And his argument was, your child doesn't need Ritalin, therefore I'm not prescribing it to you, I'm not doing the prescription for you, you'll have to take it somewhere else. And he was Polish. In Poland, for example, medication for ADHD is not a common response. And what other countries like Sweden do as well, for example, is prescribe things like family therapy or cognitive behaviour therapy. So rather than thinking about medication as a response, they think about therapeutic responses instead. Okay, now I'm just going to kind of leave that there because that is quite a contentious issue in terms of that. There is that question around who does benefit from that child being medicated. So I can think of a learner that I used to work with, I'll call him John. John used to have Ritalin 3 times a day. So we used to have it before he came to school. We used to have to give it to him at lunchtime, and he used to have it before he went to bed at night as well. If he'd missed one of those doses, you really knew that he hadn't taken it. Normally because he tried to jump off the school roof, or he was out in the road dancing in front of the traffic, or he tried to climb through the next door neighbour's upstairs window, or whatever he was doing, you could tell that he hadn't taken that medication. So his behaviours were definitely challenging. However, when he did have that medication, he would sit there, he would be quiet, he would be docile, great for the rest of the class. But he used to tell me, you know what, I still can't learn this morning. I've had that medication and I've now got a massive headache. Or it feels like someone punched me in the face, he used to say, and I just feel really discombobulated. I can't concentrate. One of the side effects of Ritalin is an impact on sleep. So being told to take Ritalin before going to bed didn't really help him that much because he'd be wide awake all night. The Ritalin would kind of wear off at about 5 or 6 in the morning. And then he was getting tired. Then he had to take another dose before he came to school. So he kind of said, well, if I take the medication, I can't learn because I constantly feel tired. I've got a headache. I can't concentrate. But if he hadn't taken it, then realistically, no one else in the class could learn because I now worked a step ladder trying to get him off a roof before he hurts himself, for example. But is there an argument for and against medication? And if so, who benefits? Okay, so I'll just kind of leave that there. So we're going to move on then and think briefly about sensory and or physical needs. So this is the kind of the last area of need that we haven't touched on as yet. So realistically here we're talking about someone with a physical disability, a visual impairment or a hearing impairment. Potentially we might be talking about learners who need specific resources or equipment. Potentially we might be looking here like some of those learners we saw on the Ysgoloderi video who need support for things like personal care, eating, toileting, transportation, as well as their educational support. So we're going to go through this in a little bit of detail a little bit later on. So I'm going to do this kind of the wrong way around realistically. So the first thing I'm going to ask you to do is to work in a pair or a group or individually if you prefer. And what I'd like you to do is to pick either hearing impairment, visual impairment, or physical impairment. And I'm going to ask you to come up with kind of a 2-page, I'm going to call it an information sheet because I can't think of what else to call it. So realistically, on that first page, whichever your area of need is that you've chosen, what I'd like you to think about what might be the challenges that that learner experiences. So if you are looking at visual impairment, what do we mean by that? How might that impact upon the learner? So that learner with a visual impairment in class, how does that impact upon their everyday experience? The second part of that information sheet is what I'd like you to do is to try and find out what might be seen as being beneficial in supporting that need. Now, in some cases, these are really basic kind of everyday things. Thinking about where that learner sits in class, asking that learner where do they hear or see best, for example. It could be simple things like making sure that we don't change the layout of our classroom. So that learner who's got kind of a visual impairment, they've learned to work out how to get from the door to their desk to the cupboards at the back of the room. I've now changed the table layout today and I haven't told them. That's going to cause issues. Or things like making sure, simple things, people have got their coats hanging up. People have got their bags underneath their desks. So the kind of walkways around the room are clear. But what I'd also like you to think a little bit about as well is, are there more specific types of support or resources? So I'm going to show you a very brief video a little bit later on of some resources used to support some learners with a hearing impairment. And in particular, what I'd like you to find out is, are there any examples of assistive technology that might be useful? So we've talked previously about teaching assistants as being a common response to support and inclusion in the classroom. Maybe today, increasingly, the use of assistive technology is having a similar impact. So when we're thinking about a learner with a hearing impairment, what sort of types of technology might be useful? So there could be specific things like hearing loops, for example. But equally, there might be something that's kind of IT related. If we're thinking about somebody with a visual impairment, what might we find useful? So we might be thinking about things like kind of text-to-speech pens, for example, or immersive readers on a screen. All right, and I'm going to give you, it's 10:52 now. What I'm going to say is we're going to report back on this at 11:10, and you can kind of come in and out and have that break during this kind of 18-minute period as well. So between now and 11:10, make sure you go and stretch your legs if you need to, go and use the bathroom if you need to, go and get a coffee if you need one. But can you also please post something onto that Padlet, either hearing impairment, a visual impairment, or a physical impairment? What might be the challenges that learner experiences? What might be some everyday tips that could be helpful in terms of supporting them in the classroom? So we've mentioned a couple, but are there things that we haven't talked about? And in particular, how might assistive technology support that particular area of need? Okay, I've talked at you for 53 minutes now, so I'm going to stop. So 11:10, if we're happy to kind of come back as a group and see what people have posted, do this activity, go in and out as you need to in terms of a break during that time as well, and I will pick it up then. So whilst you're discussing that, I'll pause the recording. Press the right button. Fab. Okay, so first of all then, thank you very much for starting to post those information sheets. I will pick up and show you some slides shortly just to see how these kind of compare with what you found. The slides that I'm going to show you realistically are very basic, but I've taken them from kind of the PGCE programme in terms of kind of common simplistic tips. So looking at the benevolent stork then has talked about potential issues. So I think that's a really good point to start off with in terms of that spectrum of need. So when we're talking about a visual impairment, this can be full blindness compared to mild, however that is identified, visual challenges. So that's important that it's on a spectrum. So very much when we thought about autism the other day, thinking about it being on that spectrum as well. Can have an impact in terms of social skills, difficulty in terms of physically moving around the classroom, for example. And then you've got some examples there of different strategies that might be useful. So in terms of technology, screen readers. So can be really useful. So I don't know if anyone's used this previously, for example, but that kind of screen reader is built into Canvas. If you click on the immersive reader button at the top of the page, it changes the format of the screen and it'll read out the information that's on there for you. So that's quite useful. Magnification software. Yeah, do you know what? I just need the text in size 45 rather than size 20, for example. So having that magnification option. Plenty of room around the classroom that's uncluttered so that the person can find their way around. Extra time might be helpful, but we'll think about this a little bit later on in terms of reasonable adjustments as to what is that extra time for. And does the learner know what the extra time is for? And have we helped them to understand and use that extra time specifically? Okay, detailed oral instructions. Potentially we might need Braille, for example. So the Careful Caterpillar have been talking a little bit about physical disabilities. So thinking about, for example, do you know what, there are certain times of the day where it's really busy around school. So is it potentially helpful to allow that learner to leave a lesson 5 minutes early, for example? So at one point, many years ago, I used to work in Bryn Gwyn School in Llanelli, which is a really weird building in that it won awards for its architecture in the 1970s, yet I don't think it worked really well as a school building, because what it tended to have was 5 different corridors that all ended up in a central hall area, which was also where they used to do the tuck shop and food at break time as well. So realistically, during break times or in between lessons, you had 1,200 teenagers all converging on this one space, trying to get through each other to where they were going. Okay, so not particularly helpful in terms of physical movement, so potentially finding ways around that kind of human traffic would be helpful. Thinking about auditory difficulties, so thinking about things like lip reading, for example, so potentially where might the learner need to sit to be able to do that appropriately. Hearing loops, so I'm just going to show you a very brief part of a video shortly. We can see those being used in action. Staff using microphones to amplify their voice. Visual difficulties, again thinking about seating position using fonts. The humble llama, thinking about kind of physical impairment, so challenges again about moving around school or the classroom. Thinking back to when you were in school, how much did you carry with you in your rucksack on a daily basis? Might you need support in terms of somebody helping you with those kind of tasks? A recognition that some tasks might just take longer. Therefore, do we give people different ways to show their understanding, or do we give them extra time to do it? This is a really good point as well at the bottom about playtime. Okay, we might be thinking about how we can support that learner in the classroom, but what happens if there's a big step to go out into the playground? Are they able to go and join in their friends at break time? for example. So have we thought about those things as well? And then some of the challenges, we see this in the Keir Hardie building a lot. The lift is broken down. Thinking about ways in which we can get learners to engage. And then Anonymous has posted on there about hearing loss as well, and has used the different colours to kind of prompt to different aspects. So thank you very much for sharing those. So just going to go through very, very briefly with you some information in terms of this. So thinking about hearing impairment, again, really good point. People have mentioned about this potential spectrum, very mild to profound. Okay, about 1 in 1,000 children in the UK roughly are born with a hearing loss. And I think this is a really interesting point. About 90% of those children are born to hearing parents. Okay, so that challenge that parents face in terms of, well, we don't understand the challenges our baby, our young child is facing because we are hearing. What can we do in terms of that? Thinking about the term deaf, okay, so we can also be thinking about temporary issues like glue year, for example. And we've mentioned this briefly before, which can be contentious. Are we looking at lowercase d or capital D in terms of deaf, which can impact upon a person's identity, for example? So capital D deaf tends to be children who've been deaf from birth or deaf from before the age where people start to talk. So they're kind of known as prelingually deaf. And potentially this is an important distinction because maybe these children or these people have never had speech. Therefore, they have learned to communicate in a particular way, which might be sign language. Potentially others with a hearing impairment might have lost hearing gradually once they had developed speech, for example. So again, bearing that in mind in terms of that spectrum. Now, I'm just going to show you a couple of minutes from this video because I think this is quite a nice one in terms of highlighting inclusion, to be honest. This is a video that comes from NASEN, or NASEN, N-A-S-E-N. Has anybody come across NASEN or NASEN previously? If you have or if you haven't, this is kind of a national organisation for special education and needs. So it's an organisation based in England where they do a lot of support in terms of supporting families and supporting staff development about special education needs or additional learning needs. One of the things they do, which I think are really good, so I'm just going to signpost it now, is they do quite often have free webinar sessions, which are online. I went to one last week, for example, which was looking at assistive technology and how that might be used in settings like people referral units, which was quite interesting in terms of what people were talking about. So if you are interested moving forward in ALN, SEN, going on to the NASEN or NASEN website is quite useful. You can register, it's free to register with them, and once you've registered, you kind of get put onto their mailing list where they send out they're doing these webinars or activities. Quite helpful in terms of going along to those. So this particular NASEN video I'm going to show you. As I said, I'm just going to show you the first couple of minutes of this. This is a learner who is deaf, attending a mainstream school in Birmingham. Just want to see what you think really in terms of how they're supported and the kind of the cultural ethos of the setting.
The pupils at our school have countless strengths. Sophia is extremely resilient. She has the highest of aspirations.
What would you like to be when you're grown up?
Be the first deaf Prime Minister.
Wow.
She will teach everybody and anybody that she meets BSL. She's just a wonderful human being, really. All children are valued so that they can believe that they can be the best version of themselves.
being deaf can influence lots of things. When hearing child is born, this learning from the environment, right? So you learn by overhearing people, by talking to people, by socializing. When you're deaf and you have this limited auditory access, obviously you miss all this auditory input. So that immediately has an effect on your language, on your speech, on your social emotional development.
How we create positive deaf identity is by providing meetups for the children so that they meet the deaf community of Birmingham and actually of the United Kingdom by purchasing books that have deaf characters and having BSL across the school as our foreign language. I think it's important to create that positive deaf identity so children's social, emotional and mental health is looked after and actually so they see themselves in the wider world.
Okay, so I'm conscious of time, I'm just going to pause that there. But quite a few things, I think, just in that first couple of minutes that really stand out to me in terms of some of the discussions we've had around inclusion previously, for example. So those learners, part of a mainstream school, had challenges. The school had put adaptations in place, so we saw things like a hearing loops being used, for example. But some key words, I think, that came out to me there. All our learners have strengths. We have high aspirations for all our learners. And I like that bit as well, where they were focusing on positive deaf identity, and in particular trying to find resources and books that had deaf characters, for example, so you see yourself represented within wider society in a positive way. So quite a lot, I think, of social model type things going on in that particular setting. The clip is on Canvas if you want to watch it in a bit more detail. It's a 10-minute clip which links to a longer one if you want to follow that up. Okay, so in terms of that, bear with me a second, lots of fiddling about doing slides. So in terms of that, what are some of the impacts? So you've mentioned these, I think, on the kind of Padlet. So children have challenges in terms of picking up communication skills, can feel socially isolated. So if you have a hearing impairment and you can't hear what people are saying to you, then it's very difficult to engage and interact with those people around you. Is evidence to suggest that has an impact on kind of course choices and vocational choices? Okay, there's no point in thinking about that as a career because you're deaf, for example. So we do tend to still see some of those things in practice. And again, this is a very basic slide that I've taken from the kind of the PGCE course, for example, thinking about some very simplistic tips. Now, again, some of these people are picked up on, but again, there's things on there when I look back, I know I was quite guilty of some of these things. Okay, standing there writing something on the board, facing away from the class, but still talking at the same time. Not going to be an impact for everyone, but there are some people who might be focusing on lip reading who now are excluded because they can't see my mouth, for example. Thinking about using visual images. And then we've got some things for a little bit more focused. Okay, thinking about seating position. Okay, so people mentioned that. I think this is a really key one as well. Don't shout. Okay, we saw a lot of those learners in the last video, for example, we were in particular different types of hearing aids and hearing loops. They can hear because that equipment is set at a particular volume. If I'm shouting to be heard at them, that's not going to help. And then I think this is a key one as well. Potentially, we might have seen this to some extent when we talked about teaching assistants. Maybe some learners have an interpreter with them in class. And I think it's quite common, unfortunately, that what we do is we talk to the interpreter rather than talking to the child. So realistically, the interpreter is there to support that communication between us. Okay, so thinking about where your focus is going. A visual impairment, okay, so maybe a little bit more common. All sorts of challenges in relation to visual impairment. Again, this is on a spectrum from kind of profound blindness to gradual visual loss, for example. And then I'm just going to show you some of this clip as well. And again, I think this clip is really interesting in terms of what it tells us about inclusion, really. And I've taken this from the RNIB. And as I said, I think this is interesting. So I'm going to play you a little bit of this in a bit more detail. Again, just want to see what you pick up in terms of this, really.
Born at 36 weeks. She was a tiny, tiny little thing. We'd just been discharged and we were getting her ready to get her home. And she just, her eyes rolled back and she had she had a seizure. The only diagnosis we were getting was failure to thrive. And I remember saying to my husband that she's got a squint or there's something wrong with her eyes. She'd had significant brain damage, she had optic nerve atrophy, she has nystagmus, inverted squints in all directions, and this marking on her eye. It was pretty dire. The first 2 years of her life, I feel guilty that I kind of missed them. I didn't enjoy them because I was grieving.
If you pull the material down it, that's it. Good girl. That's your first stitch done. Do you want to feel that first stitch? For your purse.
But as she grew and she always smiled, she was always so happy, she was always so content.
Stitch to stitch all the way round the outside.
It was so hard to be sad around her.
Beautiful, well done.
And then as you watch that child grow and how hungry and how enthusiastic she was for life and how she enjoyed learning, it felt only right to encourage that. I wanted mainstream for her. I couldn't get my head around the idea of a special school. So as it stands, she accesses every part of the curriculum.
Yep.
What was Walter like yesterday?
She'll go there with her other teacher and then do her braille.
Good afternoon, early grade. Today we are focusing on reading I and D words. Let's see how we can do.
She loves learning braille and she's really hungry to learn, but she is struggling, unfortunately, because of her cerebral palsy, she's struggling to isolate her fingers on her right hand.
Can this one test as well? Right hand?
She keeps trying, she doesn't give in.
Yeah.
Can we practice that if you find hard?
Oh, yeah. Let's try it.
Super. The word are you?
It's Y.
Good.
Let's get along with the Y.
Super. Great. It's 1 minute 39. That's your fastest yet.
Daughter has particularly loves literacy, it's something I really want for her.
Once upon a time there was a little girl called Little Red Riding Hood, and she took some bread and some cheese to a granny who wasn't very well. She walked through the woods, and in the woods she met a big bad wolf.
It seems to be a big thing that it seems to matter to people what she can and can't see. I struggle to see why it's relevant.
And then she went to Granny's house.
She's never known sight.
Little Red Hood said, "What big eyes you have! All the better to see with."
So it's not something she's missing, it's who she is.
And Little Red Riding Hood and Granny got out. The end.
She's perfectly aware there's areas of independence that she doesn't have, that other children have. She independently with a cane gets the bus to school now, and I think that's one that she feels that she owns and she really enjoys.
No, Mum, I can't do that.
She's so sharp, she's so on the ball.
She does, then.
So like the blindness still seems like the smallest thing.
Charlie here. Got it right, Charles. Right. I'll go and get dressed. Yeah, two. It's very annoying being over there. Down here I keep my cloth guys at night. There's that starry light. This is my kitchen here. My 10 friends were Horrid Henry and Pleasant Peter, and that's the bowl that Henry used.
She embraces everything. I can't imagine her any other way, and I wouldn't change it for the world because I think that's what makes her glorious.
I love going to school. I love going to school. Don't I, Mum?
Yes, you do.
I love it.
Okay, just going to pause that there. Again, I think that's a really interesting clip in terms of what comes out. I think listening to Mum speaking, really interesting in terms of the start, talking about, you know what, I really didn't enjoy the first couple of years of her life because I was grieving potentially for the child that I didn't have. However, that acceptance, that recognition that is who she is. And I like that phrase at the end, that's what makes her fabulous. I think, again, mainstream school, to see some of the strategies that were in place. So in the curriculum with other children, but being withdrawn at time for support in terms of Braille. You saw some of the kind of the multi-sensory information and ways of teaching that were being used. So the bit with the tennis balls, for example, in terms of supporting Braille. So some really nice bits, I think, in terms of that video that are really interesting. Now, some of the challenges, now again, people have mentioned in terms of these, that difficulty of getting around potentially, that difficulty in terms of accessing the curriculum. I think this is a really interesting one in terms of as we get older, for example, as well. One of the key challenges older adults experience with a visual impairment is increased danger of trips and falls, for example. As you get older, you're more likely to do yourself more damage if you trip and fall. Therefore, do we lose our independence as a result of that? And I think that was really nice in that video about how she was independent and able to get the bus herself, which is a huge thing. Then some very simple tips. So thinking about explaining visual material, giving oral instructions, making sure we use student names so they know that we are specifically talking to them. And again, thinking about some of the things on the right-hand side of the board, which people mentioned as well. Making sure we have a consistent classroom arrangement. We saw that bit when she went home and her and her mum were kind of chatting about, well, her mum had put something in the way and it was really annoying that she'd done it because it isn't normally there, for example. So just thinking about some of those things. So the final thing that I want to do with you this morning is to think a little bit about what do we mean by exam access arrangements and reasonable adjustments. Okay, now people have mentioned these to some extent previously. There is a little bit of debate in society about how appropriate these are. So we talked about this when we looked at dyslexia, for example, that about 1 in 5 children at the moment have a reasonable adjustment for their exams. And people are going, oh, that's too many, that's just middle-class parents playing the system to make sure their child gets the biggest advantage. My opinion is nonsense, but I just wanted to mention what these reasonable adjustments are. Now, when you think back to being in school, you would have done GCSEs, you would have done A-levels, potentially you were part of that kind of COVID cohort that went through where some of those experiences were kind of denied you. But when we think about exams in particular, reasonable adjustments are put in place to help support learners to access the examination in a way that meets their needs. Reasonable adjustments don't make the exams easier. Okay, so just trying to think of an analogy. So if your exam was asking you to make a 3-tier, 3-flavoured Japanese wobble cake, for example, which is one of my favourite ever things on Bake Off, a reasonable adjustment wouldn't be, you know what, you're dyslexic, you can make a fruit salad instead because that's easier. That's a really rubbish analogy, but the purpose of these adjustments isn't to make the exams or the task easier or less challenging. The purpose is to try and give people equitable opportunities to access the exam and to show what they can do. So rather than go in, you've got to write a 5,000-word essay for this, you know what, you can take a photo instead because that's easier. What it would do would be to offer people support to be able to access that exam in a way that meets their needs. Now, there's a few things that schools need to put in place when they're looking at exam access arrangements. I've taken all this from a document which is on the next slide, and these highlights on there again are mine. Okay, now the exam access arrangements, if people have these in place, these 2 bits here are key, I suppose. They need to be the learner's normal way of working. So in other words, the learner is getting stressed because the exam is coming up. But what we're also going to do is to get them to work in a way that they've never done before, because that's also stressful. And there should also be a history of need. So unless someone has kind of fallen off their bike and broken both wrists the week before their exam, realistically, these needs learners are showing, we should know about that in school in advance. Okay. When we're thinking about reasonable adjustments, and I've looked at this slide again this morning, and I've, for some reason, I don't know why I've repeated some of these things, but there are all sorts of things that people might be able to get that helps. So the most common one probably is extra time. And normally, if there is evidence that a learner needs it, they can get extra time up to 25%. So if the exam is an hour, then you get 15 minutes extra for every hour of the exam. Okay, so why might that extra 25% of the time be needed? So it could be because the learner has got a slower than average writing speed, or they've got a slower than average reading speed, or they've got a slower than average processing speed. Now, I had to write these figures down this morning because I wasn't quite sure. If we're thinking about the average 16-year-old in the UK, the average writing speed is 20 words per minute, roughly. Okay, now that varies somewhere between about 13 and 25. It depends on what type of task you're doing. But if we suggest as a rule of thumb, the average 16-year-old can write 20 words in a minute. If they've got a 1-hour exam, that means they should be able to write 1,200 words if they kept that speed up all the way through. A learner who would qualify for extra time, to have that extra 15 minutes, they would need to write at a speed which is 15 words per minute or less. Okay, now that doesn't sound like a massive difference. Is 15 words a minute that much shorter than 20 words per minute? But 20 words per minute, you can write 1,200 words in an hour. If you write 15 words per minute, you can write 900 words in an hour. That's a 300-word difference, which is about a page of A4. Okay, so potentially you might need extra time because just you write slower. Therefore, you can't show all your thoughts in that 1 hour because you won't write quickly enough to be able to do that. Or potentially your reading speed is slower. Now, again, this is kind of very vague. The average reading speed for a 16-year-old is somewhere between 195 and 204 words a minute. So somebody who would get 25% extra time, for example, they might be reading 140 words per minute. So it's just going to take you longer to read the information. Other things people might get, so a scribe. So in some cases, it might be somebody has a person who writes the answers for them. In some cases, people might have a word processor. So instead of physically handwriting, you get a laptop to type it up instead. Some people get a practical assistant. So somebody who might have a physical challenge and finds it difficult to pick up a pen or to move a ruler on a page. They can have somebody who sits with them and helps them with that. So they can pick up the pen and put it in the person's hand, and then the person can then write with the pen that they've got. Other things might include, you might need a magnified paper, or you need it on different coloured paper. That is kind of relatively straightforward to do. However, schools are only allowed to open the exam papers half an hour before people are due to sit them. So if you've got an exam starting at 10 o'clock on a Monday morning, school legally isn't allowed to open it until 9:30 on that day. So if somebody needs blue paper, the exam companies send everything out on white paper. School needs permission to be able to open those papers early enough to photocopy them onto different coloured paper and give it to that person, as an example. And then other things people might have, you're really anxious doing this in the hall with everyone else, so you might be able to do this in a smaller classroom with a handful of people because it takes that anxiety away. All right, so a range of different reasonable adjustments that people might have. So what I'm going to ask you to do very quickly is if you click on that image there's a hyperlink on there which will take you to something called the Joint Council for Qualifications Reasonable Adjustments document. Now, this used to be about 200 pages long. They've shortened this to about 60 now. But what I'd like you to do is have a go at answering these 4 questions. Okay, so I've put what particular page you need to look at. So realistically, if You were working in a school and one of your learners was doing their GCSEs next June. What is the deadline that schools have to apply for these adjustments by? So, as we said, unless someone's had an accident or they've broken their arm the week before, there is a deadline, a cut-off for schools to be able to ask for these things. Second question, in most cases, requests are granted. So do you know what? This person needs 25% extra time and it needs to be on blue paper and they need to do this in a room by themselves because of anxiety. However, requests aren't always granted, and there are 3 particular reasons why a request might be turned down. So I'd just like you to have a quick look at that. The third one, this is quite a complicated one. There is a quick case study on there about a dyslexic learner who's applied for support to help them in an English and a Spanish GCSE. And realistically, the support they are allowed is different across those subjects. I'd just like you to have a quick look and think why. And it's also different on different parts of the paper, why that might be the case. And then very briefly, if we get time, question 4, this may be one that you want to follow up on afterwards. For somebody to get extra time, what might somebody need to have? Okay, so I'm going to be really annoying and give you just 2 minutes. Maybe if you have a look at the first and second one, and then if you are interested, you can follow this up afterwards. Okay, so any school putting someone in for an exam, if they are applying for something different for that learner, this is the guidelines. The guidelines change every year. So something that might not have been allowed last year might be allowed this year. Something that was allowed this year might not be next year. And there are standard things that people have to do to show that the learner needs it and show that it's helpful. So, for example, if you are dyslexic and you've been given 25% extra time, if you don't know what to do with that 25% extra time, sitting there for an extra 15 minutes whilst all your friends have gone, not doing anything, doesn't really help. If the reasonable adjustments say, do you know what, it would be really helpful if you had a laptop and you can type up your answers rather than writing, great. However, what happens if you've never used a laptop to do your work before? Is that now building in an extra layer of stress for that learner? So just have a quick look at maybe question 1 and 2, and then if this is something that you want to follow up, it's a lovely detailed document if you're interested. Okay, so I am conscious of time, so I'm going to move on shortly. But I just wanted to show really, schools have to apply by a particular time, might be turned down for different reasons. There are different types of adjustment people might have, and that might be different in different subjects. So you might have support for English, but you don't get access to that for maths, because the exam and how it's asking you to do it is different. And then just some reasons why people might be given support. Okay, so I'm going to be really annoying again and move on very quickly. I just wanted to say next week, I know next week is the final session. Obviously, it would be a little bit harsh of me to talk about anything next week that I would expect you to put into your assignment due the day after. Okay, so realistically next week, for those of you that are able to make it, what we're going to do is think a little bit more widely about inclusion. And rather than focus on learners with additional learning needs, we're going to think about other groups of learners that might experience challenges as well. So we're very briefly going to think about things like children who are in looked after care, children who might be young carers, asylum seeker and refugee children, people from the Gypsy Roma traveller community, for example, the impact of poverty, the impact of gender, the impact of sexuality, and one that's becoming increasingly prevalent, the impact of living in an area that's affected by climate change and environmental degradation. What happens to your access to school if your school no longer exists because it's been blown down by a hurricane that didn't need to happen, for example. So we're going to think about those things next week. Nothing to do with any of the assignments, So maybe just something a little bit extra and a little bit different. Okay, and then the final thing I want to mention, and I promise stop talking to you at that point. When you look at this page, the core learning resources, I did mention earlier on about doing some end of semester feedback. Now, I'm not going to give you time to do it now, but Karen in particular and myself and the other tutors would be really grateful if you were happy to post something onto the link. I've put a brief, what's this called, PowerPoint up on there. So realistically, one end of semester feedback form rather than 3 separate ones for each of the 3 modules. Some of you I know were only doing this education module and you're not doing the other 2, so just focus on the 1, 2 or 3 that you're doing. And what is asking you to think about is your experience on the module this semester. Now, one of the best pieces of feedback I ever remember reading, which had nothing to do with the module, somebody once gave my module a 0 out of 5, and their feedback was, I really liked the module, but I'm disgusted that chips and a muffin cost £7 in the canteen. Okay, and I totally agree with it, discussed about the prices, but that was nothing to do with the module. All right, so given that 0 out of 5 because chips were expensive, I can't do anything about that. All right, so in particular, you're thinking about the modules itself. You're thinking about feeding back, and it's going to ask you to feed back on these different areas. Okay, so teaching quality, okay, have people explained things in a way that was understanding? Has anything in the modules informed, changed, underpinned, supported your thinking? Learning opportunities, okay, have you had the opportunity to share your thoughts? Have you had the opportunity to link your thoughts to previous experiences or previous understanding? Academic support. Have staff answered emails if you sent one? Have staff been helpful in terms of contact and support? Learning resources. Now, there's not a lot as module tutors we can do about the IT and library resources, but thinking about things like, was there stuff up on Canvas? Were the PowerPoint released at least the week or in a few days before the lecture so that you had them in advance? Were there additional materials that you could look at? Assessment and feedback. Now, if you fill this in today, realistically, you won't get any feedback from me until tomorrow. So you don't know today whether the feedback is helpful or not. So if you are filling this in today, if you haven't had feedback as yet on a particular module, and leave that one as kind of blank, as if you say, I've had no feedback, well then that could be because somebody hasn't given it to you rather than because it wasn't due by the time you fill that in, if that makes sense. And then finally, the student voice. Did you have the chance to kind of inform what we do? Have people listened to you and people fed back to you? And then in terms of accessing the survey, there's 2 ways you can do it. One of them is scanning the QR code. What I would say, I only found out this out this morning, if you scan the QR code, what it'll ask you to do is to log into your university student account to be able to access the link. However, if you click on that link, famous last words, it should take you straight to it. Okay, so between now and Friday the 12th of December, which is the last day of term before you break up for Christmas, be very grateful if you could please fill in that kind of end of semester feedback for the modules that are relevant to you. Okay. Other than that, it's 11:52, so I'm going to stop talking. Once again, thank you very much for coming this morning. Thank